really great be in community with you all and have this conversation. Please feel free to ask questions. And I'm trying to get us set up to share. But let this be a conversation. I want to, there's going to be a lot of information on the screen, and don't want folks to feel overwhelmed by that. I'm going to, like, in my words in this conversation, like, really break this down. But feel free to, like, raise your hand, use the chat, unmute. So here we go. So really briefly and broadly, Poder is a Spanglish initiative that was started a couple years ago in preparation for the 2020 elections. Regardless of how that decision was going to end up, I felt that we needed to get more folks from our community involved and make these conversations less boring, right? And more relevant and pertinent and accessible to my community and our communities like ours, like everyone in this room. Because I feel like the usual conversations around this aren't affirming or accessible to, like, our realities and what our priorities and needs are. So hopefully Poder is, like, fulfilling that mission by having conversations like this. So again, super grateful for everyone's time. What we're going to discuss today is we're going to go over what a ballot measure is. You'll hear ballot measure, ballot proposal, ballot initiative. We're going to define that and kind of clarify what that is. Then we're going to review the ballot measures, ballot proposals that are going to be up for election in November, and kind of go into the details of that. And then we're also going to talk about what making a voting plan means and is. I'm sure folks have heard it. If you haven't, that's fine, because we're here to learn stuff. So I got you. Okay, so really broadly, this is the official kind of formal definition that comes from Ballotpedia, which I think is a great resource, and I've hyperlinked here for you all. But a ballot measure is basically like an issue or a question or a specific thing that comes up from different bodies, right? It could be an individual citizen, like one of us, could be like, feel really strongly to get something done and go through the processes to get a ballot measure, and that requires, like, signatures and endorsements and, like, drafting it. But we could do that. There could be, like, a legislator, like a government body, like some of our politicians might be putting this forward as a question for voters to decide or inform on. Or if it's kind of set up that way, like it's an automatic thing that, like, is placed on the ballot. All that to say, right, is I think ballot measures are an opportunity for all of us, for voters, to, like, actually decide on a specific policy or thing. Usually when we vote on candidates, that's, like, on principles in the hopes that they'll advance kind of policies and laws that affirm us and that are in alignment with our values. But ballot measures are an opportunity for us to tell our government, whether it's local government, state government, or federal government, hey, this is how I feel about this specific policy and measure. Yes, I agree with it. No, I do not. Is that a helpful definition for folks? Do folks have a question about that? What that means? All right, dope. So with that in mind, we have 4 ballot proposals, ballot measures, that you're gonna see on your ballot when you go to vote. And so we wanted to kind of have a conversation and explain what these are and what these mean, so that when you go to vote, you're like, I know how I'm gonna decide on these 4 proposals. So the first one is an environmental bond act. So it's the whole formal title is called the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act of 2022. We know that we're currently in a climate crisis, which is a result of capitalism and like neglect of our kind of our environment and like the westernization of what culture and like what is ethically acceptable to do, right? In the pursuit of making money, right? So we need to address these things. And we can't just say that we need to address these things. We need to like have commitments to solving these problems. And so this act would mean that the state is going to essentially allocate funds towards fixing these types of problems, right? And I'm sure we all know and would agree, right? Like money talks, like we could talk the talk, but like when you put money behind something, it demonstrates a commitment to solving this issue. And you know, committing resources is actually an opportunity to like really start figuring out how we as the state of New York could advance this kind of policy, right? And so for folks who are numbers people, I know I get numbers anxiety, but some folks enjoy kind of like what this means. What it's asking for is to commit $4.2 billion towards solving like infrastructure issues around climate action, and also like identifying, right, what conservation in this state should look like, right? So thinking about, you know, natural habitats. That there was a study, I forget where, definitely on social media, but the exact source I cannot tell you. But like a large portion of like wildlife, 79, don't quote me, but it's a ridiculous amount. We in 2018 have just decimated like 79% of wildlife in the world, right, as humans. And that's not a problem that is going to be like solved passively. Also, this is a racial justice issue, right? Because the communities that stand to be most burdened by climate collapse are communities of color, right? Most recently, we could reference many countries and islands in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, right? During hurricane season, right? Those are communities of color, right? Who lack the infrastructure and resources to literally weather this storm. And that's unacceptable. Similarly, we're going to see disparities within the city. Across the 5 boroughs, when you think of neighborhoods that are most at risk to being flooded, right? Or kind of being impacted by kind of any, we saw Hurricane Sandy, we saw, I'm trying to think about there haven't been earthquakes recently, I don't think. But anyway, the infrastructure in communities of color are not developed enough to withstand any climate emergency that the city should experience, right? Particularly speaking for New York City. So this puts money towards solving that problem. People who support it are just like, great, awesome, we're putting money towards solving this very important issue that I feel strongly about. Other people have concerns about just like, well, really, if we allocate this money, are we actually going to do something about it? Or is the state just like spending money to spend money and say that they're solving the problem? So if you wanted to look into this issue further, right, this is something that you're really passionate about, you could like spend an afternoon, bus ride, train ride to work, like Googling this stuff and like getting really intentional with it. But this ballot proposal is essentially saying, hey, would you agree that climate conservation is important enough that we should fund this? We should, as a state, put resources to solving this problem. Yes, I would agree. No, I do not agree. Would be your options. Any questions on this proposal?
Sir, I have a question.
Go for it.
Now when we vote on these issues, right, and the money is allocated to whatever issue is voted on. Now, does this take away from other possible things, or when we vote on this, or this is like the money is set for each specific proposal?
So are you sorry, there's an echo. Asking that if we say yes to funding this problem, it's not coming from another budget somewhere else?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Great question. From what it looks like here, particularly, it's saying that the selling of state bonds, which are like assets that the state has that they could sell to make money. So it sounds like no, they're actually going to not impact any other programs, but sell assets to raise money to fund this from like other assets that aren't.
And now each proposal states things like this, where they're getting the money from.
Some do, some don't. Our proposals, like a couple that we'll discuss today, don't have a budget, aren't budget related. But this one specifically does, right? It's saying that this is how much money we're going to put behind this solving this problem, but not all of them require it.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Now, to that point though, if you're a voter who you like this, numbers are important. And if you've seen the numbers that you feel comfortable with, and that's a decision point for you, that's okay. And if you see a proposal where you're just like, yeah, I agree with solving this issue, but they haven't told me enough about the money, so I'm going to say no until they do, like that is also a way someone could vote, like strategically. Depends on what's important to you as a person, right? When discussing these topics. Make sense? I hope so. Any other questions? Sorry, before we move on.
John, I just wanted to clarify, when it says creating that $4,200,000,000 from state debt, is when they say that they're creating state debt, are they creating state debt by fundraising for this amount, or like, can you maybe kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Sure, that's a great question. From my understanding of this text and the research that I did is that they have, like, when we think stocks and bonds, like they have state investments or investments in assets that they are looking to sell in order to create and like fundraise this money, right? Which is kind of very macroeconomic stuff. Like I'm not trying to sell nothing about my own possessions to like find money that I need often. But anyway, this is, when you hear debt, a lot of this is like investment banking. So no one has $4.2 billion liquid, but that is, I'm assuming, what the state bonds would be used as, like kind of financial collateral for this loan to solve this problem.
That makes sense. Thank you.
It doesn't really, to me. I'm glad it makes sense to you. In my mind, it was just like, why are we going into debt to fund things? This is a common practice. It doesn't necessarily, when you're dealing with monies this big, when you think about it, there is no $4.2 billion actual dollars sitting anywhere at one place. So a lot of it is just like monopoly money, really. But that's a different conversation for a different time. But great questions. All right, so to, I think it was Jose's question and point, right? This is a proposal that doesn't have a budget. It's not really budget involved, but it's more kind of like values involved. So what you see on the screen is like literally the words that you'll see on your ballot. But a kind of breakdown of what it means and what the details are is that a charter is kind of like our mission orders as a local government, right? When we think of the national kind of mission orders, it's the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States talks about how the federal government is supposed to run. And states have their own constitutions, state constitutions. Cities don't really have their own constitutions because they all are part of the state, but they do have charters. And charters explain what the mission of the government of that city, of that local government is supposed to do. Because, you know, we're in an era across the country where we're critically engaging conversations around trying to critically engage conversations around justice and racial equity, particularly in the government. This kind of codifies and like really writes it into the rules of the city that this is part of the city government's responsibility, is to lead and support its citizens with a critical understanding and investment in kind of historical injustices, right? The diversity of the needs across the city, right? And the responsibility to address those needs, and being like one of the richest cities in the country, right? With all these, like, they make money off of taxpayers, right? So like we pay taxes and you gotta be looking out for all of us. So this is more of a values thing. Doesn't really ask for a budget, but it says in order to hold this city government accountable, we are putting it into the rules of what the city government is supposed to do. Some kind of comments that are in support of this would be, you know, this codifies and is a system of accountability to make sure that we're addressing this, right? And it, you know, codifies these things and immortalizes it so that it's not just a temporary conversation. Folks who are opposed are just like, yeah, this is just words. Like, what would this look like? Can you give me more details of what including this in the charter would mean? Questions about that one? I'm good on time.
I'm wondering,
Yeah, go.
does the charter state already how the preamble would, I guess, be enforced? Like if we adopt a preamble to the charter, will we then need to outline how that preamble would be enforced? Like how do we know it's gonna happen or be used?
Yeah, so my response to that, it's a great question. I am a part-time law student, and a lot of this I've learned the hard truth that a lot of the change that we are looking for and that we currently benefit from was a long-term strategy. And so what I would offer is like, we're building that out and including this in the city charter. It gives us the opportunity to argue that in the event the city fails to meet this part of the preamble, we could hold them accountable. We could sue them. You know, we could file formal grievances, because now it's a part of the conversation in an explicit way. Whereas currently, we could map out all the issues, right? All the ways that the city has messed up, right? As on a racist basis. And they'll be like, yeah, that really sucks. But, you know, it wasn't, the standard is a little harder to me. Whereas here, it's just like, nah, fam, like it's in the rules. Is that helpful?
Very much so.
But to that point, like an example and part of the long-term conversation comes from this next proposal. This is the one specifically. Do not let all these words kind of overwhelm you. I included literally copy and paste the language on the ballot so that you guys aren't, when you show up, you're like, what? This is not what I had in my head. So literally these are the words. But what this is asking for is to create an agency, like an office on racial equity, a strategic plan on how the city plans on doing this, right? Enforcing this preamble, and a commission, which a commission in my mind is like a coalition of stakeholders. It could be, I'm anticipating a lot of community-based organizations and nonprofits, but you know, whatever that looks like. And this is an example of like okay, we have it in the preamble, and now this is what we're going to do about it. This doesn't always happen, right? When ballot proposals come up, sometimes it's just like we're going to try to get it in the preamble and then figure it out. Here, the city, especially around COVID, really needed to come to terms with race and the role of race in like government services that the city provided. Obviously, because of the murder of George Floyd, like that really put pressure across the country to have this conversation. But when we looked at the race data of COVID impact, right, the ethnic data of COVID impact, it disproportionately impacted communities of color for no other reason than like racist infrastructure, right? And so this is kind of a lot of the work that has been happening over the past 2 years has kind of culminated in asking voters to decide whether the city should commit resources to this initiative. And so to clarify, the first ballot proposal for the environmental, like climate change act, that's a state initiative at 4.2 billion. This is asking for city dollars. And this is an example of they haven't outlined or explicitly stated a number of what the budget they're looking for, but this is the plan. My guess here, looking at, and again, you could refer to this on your own time, you don't have to like read all this now, but this is kind of like the strategic decisions that they want to make to start advancing some of these issues really quickly. So I currently work full-time by day. Well, that is like a part-time community service initiative, but I work for the Department of Health by day. And the Department of Health for the city of New York has been doing racial equity work for a long time, and was one of the first city agencies to have been doing anti-racist work within public health and having that conversation. The rest of the city agencies are trying to kind of adopt this type of work that the Department of Health has been doing. And so part of this office and the strategic plan would be to make sure all the other agencies are addressing race and equity in the way that they're offering their services, right? So think NYCHA is more federal because it gets federal funding, but it is a local initiative, right? Department of Social Services should absolutely have a critical race lens to their work, I think, personally. Whom else? ACS, right? Like making sure that all the city agencies, are really dismantling racism, right? Patriarchy, right? Homophobia, like bias and oppression has no role, I think, in any space, but especially in government, and especially in a city government, especially for a city of 8 million people from all over the world, right? From all these different backgrounds. It's really difficult to not have a better hold on solving these issues. And so I personally think that this is an opportunity to start solving that. People who agree with this tend to say, align with the comments that I made. Other folks are just like, well, these are a lot of words, right? And how do we make sure that these are actually solving the issue? Where's the money, right? What is the money going to look like? To Jose's point, some people have those concerns. So sit with this, think about it, think about how you feel about this issue. A lot of folks, excuse me for the background noise if you hear it, some sirens are going off. Some folks are like, this is not enough, and that's okay, right? Or other folks feel like a lot of this racial equity, critical race theory stuff is just words, and not a real thing. And so I want to make space for all opinions, but I would believe that this is a step in kind of walking the talk. Any questions on that? I know I went off a little bit.
It was interesting to hear you talk about some of the um, other agencies that would have to adopt a racial equity plan, particularly ACS. And I know this is kind of a, we're just visioning with this question, but I do wonder how an institution like an ACS, who um, in many ways have individuals who operate on very specific racial tropes and biases. Um, how would an institution like that, where it's personal and it's also um, ingrained in the way that they operate, um, like how do you see that kind of shifting with a proposal like this being approved?
Yeah, no, that is like a powerful question. I think from my experience working at the health department, which has its own set of issues, very different, I want to affirm from, the violence that ACS can perpetuate. Um, and it requires a culture change, right? It requires a value change and like what is acceptable collateral damage, right? What is acceptable harm? And we've had to have those conversations at the health department, right? When we look at health disparities, it's having, and I specifically serve in an equity role for the agency. This isn't a plug, but just so happens, I'm gonna tell you the tea. We have to have conversations where it's just like this disparity on a race basis, like these are lives, like these are people, right? And so whether it's infection, right, and they don't die, but they suffered, right? COVID was no joke. Speaking from someone who currently is like recovering from COVID, I am incredibly grateful, right, that this is now something that like is chronic and it's something that like, all right, I'm gonna be out for a couple days, but it wasn't what it was 2 years ago. Um, but that racial disparity are lives. And so really holding senior leadership and decision makers like to those facts, right? Because otherwise we're just going through the motions and doing kind of what needs to be done, quote unquote, with no intentionality. And it requires kind of, as a Latino, telling folks that it's just like, telling my family to get vaccinated was a project. That was, and you gotta understand that people are coming from a lot of these cultural backgrounds, right? And they all matter and they're all important. And we gotta like talk to everybody is how I believe. And it's a lot of like kind of the value. So anyway, all that to say is that ACS and all these other agencies are going to, through this work, have to start kind of grappling with those topics, right? And seeing their work in this way as opposed to names on paper, right? And like government dollars that need to be kind of treated in a certain way. That's very pie in the sky. It's very hard work. It's a long-term game. So you could look at all this and be like, bueno, I don't know. Or you could look at this and be like, yes, absolutely, please more. So the last one I think is really kind of exciting. Sorry, plug in. And it's talking about measuring what the cost of living in New York City is. Because it's wild out here, y'all. Like, rent is ridiculous. Food is so expensive. The bus fare keeps going up. It's like, and jobs are not matching up, right? And so I think not that this is going to solve all those issues overnight, but again, thinking about the long-term strategy and the long-term battle, this makes it somewhere to say, the cost of living for the city that I live in is this number, and I'm making less than this number, right? And so like, how are we holding businesses that work in the city accountable? a lot of like public benefits will have the potential to shift based on this new kind of income level. Because let me tell you, from my experience, just because the poverty line is unrealistic, whatever that line is, and these things be thinking that because you have like a little bit of money, you got bad money. And I'm just like, that's not how this works, y'all. Like, I'm not living in poverty, but I'm also not, Kim Kardashian, right? Like, so I need assistance, right? And that assistance is going to be adjusted based on what this kind of research is going to do. I think what's really exciting about this for me is that it measures a livable wage based on dignity rather than poverty, right? And like what destitution, like the poverty line right now is just like, this is, if you make this much money, like you are living bad. And that shouldn't be the threshold. Dignity makes us measure this, like considering people being able to pay their rent, people being able to afford the food, the average cost of food in the city, right? Which is going to be considerable because some parts of the city, a peach is like one peach is like $5. Plantains, plátanos used to be like 10 for $1. And now it's just like 3 for $1 sometimes. Anyway, it gives us the opportunity to kind of think about what is a dignified lifestyle in this city. And I think that's really, really important because I don't believe in the richest country and the richest city in the world that like people need to be struggling, that people need to be working 2-3 jobs. Like I work 2-3 jobs because I'm a little wild, but like it's no joke. And that's unacceptable to me. And so I think this is an opportunity to kind of be a North Star for what a respectable wage in the city could look like. And it'll adjust what our social services kind of measure as income that needs aid or support. Questions about this? There was a recent study that said like the average rent in the island of Manhattan is like $6,000. I'm just like, what? Meanwhile, when this was years ago, but when my mother came from Cuba and came up to the city, they got their apartment. This was 50 years ago. $800 now, but it was $600 back then. $600 50 years ago to 5,000. Same apartment. They haven't updated it. They haven't upgraded it because we've lived there the whole time. They're dying for my mother to move out. And that's, like we need to be able to either meet that need so that we have a dignified like lifestyle in all, like wherever we're located, or these landlords gotta chill because wild. All right, y'all. So any questions before we move on? We're gonna leave the technicalities behind. I've shared some links. All of this is from nycvotes.org. So you could go back and look at it. Folks who are registered to vote, I just want to kind of, because I like to hold government accountable, but also give people their roses. The Board of Elections in New York City has consistently been sending out this voter guide. It comes in English and on the backside Spanish to folks who are registered. I got all this information from their website, but check your mail and see if you received this document registered to vote, and sit with it. It's actually pretty, they did a good job, I would say. All this stuff, all this ballot proposals you could review online and in that booklet if you need some time to like reflect on this. Now, this is a little bit more kind of practical. Hope I make you laugh a little, part of the conversation, right? So a voting plan You've probably heard of it. People are giving it a lot of hype right now. And the first time I heard about this, I was just like, what? People just getting like inventing stuff now. But actually, a voting plan is like your who, what, when, where, how on when you're voting, right? So like when you vote, sorry, I'm looking at the chat real cool. No, yep, 6K, Chelsea, I saw that. When you are deciding to vote, right? It's literally thinking about, okay, what are literally the details of between when I'm leaving my house, how I'm preparing to vote, and how I'm going to leave my house to go vote and come back safely. So what that means is thinking about who you're voting for. So just like with the ballot proposals, you could visit nycvotes.org. They've done a great job at kind of explaining each of these roles. So like these roles that I have listed are all the positions that are up for election. That's a lot. You might look at this list and be like, yeah, I know what the governor does. I know what the comptroller does. You could also look at this list and be like, who are these people? Like, why do we have all these positions? That's fine. NYC Votes, you could translate it in whatever your preferred language, does a great job at explaining the roles of each kind of office and position. And then you could click to research all the candidates that are up for election. And you could look at their political history, right? See what policies, what values they hold, and figure out, what excites you. Look at a party or a candidate that aligns most closely with your values, right? Even if folks aren't, really smack dab in the middle, and figure out what your hard no's are, what your hard yeses are. Like abortion is a very important topic right now. I think always, but especially very, and reproductive justice is really relevant right now. And some folks are like, if you have made that a make or break deal, whether, it's granting reproductive justice or infringing on that justice, that could be a deal breaker for folks, right? And so figuring out what are the priorities and what are the values that you want to make sure that you see from candidates, especially when looking at their roles, right? Because the comptroller manages budget, attorneys general, I think is the technical term, is kind of like the state's head lawyer, right? And so thinking about what are the values that you think are important for candidates to serve in those roles. So that's the who you're voting for. The what you're voting for is what we just did, right? So sometimes you're going to see some proposals, and that is a specific what that you could have an opinion on. And so we did that a little bit. I invite you to go back and check it out and review it at your leisure. Curled up in your pajamas at the end of your day. I doubt that that's what you want to do, but sometimes that's what it takes. This is, I think, where it gets interesting. You could vote different ways now. So traditionally, you could vote in person, right? You could show up to the polling site and you vote in person. But especially because of COVID, you could request an absentee ballot to vote by mail. This is pretty cool. I think, I had done it. I had voted by mail over the pandemic, and I really liked it because I got to sit down with my ballot. There was no rush. There was no stress. I was like, they looking at me, I gotta finish this and get out. So, that's a different kind of experience if that's what you're into. Or if you literally have access needs that you going to the polling site would be too much. If you have a loved one that it's cold, right? It's gonna be cold in November. And sometimes these lines are long. And so if you have a loved one who's a little older or that you don't want them standing out in the cold mad long, this might be for you. So you could visit nycabsentee.com or call this number to request one. And the deadline to do that is October 24th. So Monday, this coming Monday, is the deadline for you to request it online or over the phone. Now, if you do request an absentee ballot, do it if you know that you're going to like vote by mail. Because if you decide to like, if you request the ballot and then change your mind and you're like, I want to go in person, you'll have to submit what's called an affidavit ballot. What that means, it's the same ballot, but when a regular ballot is like scanned and counted like right then and there. An affidavit ballot is like, you vote how you usually would, but then they save it to check it out, to verify it later, to make sure that they didn't receive a mail ballot from you, because they don't want you to like vote twice. So they'll take your ballot, they won't submit it and count it immediately, but they'll hold it to make sure that whether or not, because they'll have a record of showing that you requested an absentee ballot, and so they'll assume maybe this person voted by mail and forgot or whatever. So that's just a heads up for you. That's the how. Now, if you want to vote in person, there are a couple options with that too. So recently, in recent history, they started doing early voting days. I think they're great ideas because voting in one day, like only allowing one day to vote, that's not a national holiday, that's not paid time off, right? I think is unrealistic. So early voting provides more opportunity for folks. And so the early voting will start October 29th, so next Saturday, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday, and will run until Sunday, November 6th. There isn't early voting on Monday, November 7th, right? And then election day is on Tuesday, November 8th, right? And some people are just like, no, election day is the election day, and I'm gonna go vote on election day, whatever you like, However, I would say that, heads up, sometimes your early voting site is different from your election day voting site. So if you're gonna go vote early, check out Find My Poll site. It'll ask for your address, and we'll let you know, like, this is where you go if you're doing early voting, and this is where you go on election day. In my situation, like my specific situation, I checked before I met with you all today, and it just so happens to be the same site. But I know in my mom's case, who lives on the other side of Manhattan, she has two different locations. So if you go, just have that in mind when you decide. Regardless of the day that you vote, whether you vote on election day or during an early voting day, I think plan out what voting would look like practically. For example, maybe going before work is not realistic, right? Because you have to wake up early and be at work early anyway, and you're not trying to wake up early unnecessarily. Maybe lunchtime is an option for you, and that's like a slower part of the day. Your job allows for voting hours. Some positions allow like up to 4 hours to go vote. That's paid time off aside from your PTO that you've accrued. And then thinking about like voting at the end of the day, like if you're the type of person who's just ready to get home, right? You have, a little one waiting at home, right? You have responsibilities waiting at home, like whatever your situation is, like really think about that and make a plan on the time of day. This is why kind of early voting is great, because you could go on a Saturday where you might have a little more time, right? Than a work day where you've like worked for 8 hours, you got to rush home to cook or to, whatever it is that you have to do in addition to waiting in line for voting, right? And I'll tell you for the primary, when I showed up to vote, they had moved my poll site and I almost went home. I was just like, nah, not after today. But literally I was just like, I can't be poder and not like walk the walk. So I walked the extra 3 blocks around the corner and voted. So yeah, that's like really what the voting plan is. So really thinking about doing the research, doing the work, putting the thought into it, so that when you vote, like you know what you're talking about. It's not you're not voting for some cutie, right? Or you're not voting for like that person that your friend said that they liked, you know, because my mom sometimes is like, oh, you know, John F. Kennedy, that's the joke. Like John F. Kennedy was voted because he was handsome. I was just like, I guess some people did that, whatever. Um, so that's the voting plan. Any questions? Any comments?
John, I know we had a few people join us towards the end. Um, I wonder if we could go back and maybe just like see the list of things to include
Yeah,
in the voting plan so we can write that down.
yeah. So a voting plan is the who, what, when, where, and how you're going to vote, you know? And so the who and the what is like the research part. The when and the where is like if I'm going to vote in person, where am I voting? Well, when am I voting? And based on when am I voting, what's the location I'm voting? And then also what time. So I could like set the alarm and make sure I show up. And then if you're not voting in person, how is like requesting an absentee ballot and voting from home and making sure you submit it by the deadline.
Thanks, John.
No problem.
Did folks have any more questions about the voting plan or the ballot proposals that are up for choice this year? I'm also wondering if we would be able to send out the slide deck to folks who are on the call.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to do it if that's helpful.
Yes.
Or yeah, I shared it with you and hyperlinked everything specifically for that because I know that this was a lot, a lot. And so I think I like folks to like sit down and like with their cafe or whatever, their little treat,
Okay.
and like,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
All right. So you can either put in the chat or you can come on screen or you can say it out loud. I'm wondering, do folks feel like they're prepared for November 8th? If not, are there other things that you feel like you need more information on?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have a question.
Go for it.
Yeah, so once I haven't voted, to be honest with you, in quite a long time. Once you register, you always register, or do you have to like continually register like every few years or so?
That's a great question. New York State doesn't really have a harsh what's called poll purging, and like a practice of unregistering folks. I don't know what the deadline is, but it's like substantial. So you should be fine if you like at least voted within the past 10 years. I could say that confidently. Other jurisdictions, like other states you've heard like are a lot more hostile towards that. So I would check. This is a great opportunity to kind of visit NYC Votes, or like any Google voter, like check your voter registration status, and it'll tell you it'll verify whether or not you're on the polls. You should be, but I think this is also an opportunity. Like, have you moved since the last time you voted?
No, not at all. No.
Okay, so that's one those details haven't changed, so that's good. So yeah, just Google it real quick, and it'll tell you whether or not you're registered to vote.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Everybody else feeling ready for November? Leonora, I see you came off mute, but I think we still having a hard time hearing you. But feel free to put it in the chat.
Yeah, please feel free. I know folks have probably had a long day and we're at the end of it. But what I would say is like really the vision and the whole purpose about Poder is to like make this fun. Like we could make this a joyful process. So think about who you talk about, like after this conversation, like who are you gonna connect with in your life to be like, yo, you know, like we talked about ballot proposals and have you looked at that? Like, what do you think? And that's real, like that's where the powerful work happens. Cause like, I hope y'all enjoyed this process, but if someone you knew, right, personally in your life came to you with this conversation, that would be a much more kind of meaningful and impactful, right, connection. Figure out your plan and then also like actually show up to vote and figure out how like you make that process fun. Like I go vote in the morning, earlier in the morning, and then I'll go after work, pick up my mom and take her to vote. And then we'll go have dinner afterwards. Like we try to create joy. You could do it with your friends, right? You know, figure out what social activity you want to do around voting and make it, you know, it doesn't have to be boring, it doesn't have to be stressful.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm changing of device to not work. I have to go back on my phone. To be quite honest with you, I personally just vote like every 4 years, presidential. That's it. So I guess this will probably be my first time voting. Other than the presidential campaign and presidential election and stuff. So I'm always ready because I get up early be like, you know, when they open, I'm in and I'm out. So bit the traffic and
Yeah.
the long lines and stuff. I go there, you know, I got my registration card, got my ID and do. But I think this year I'm definitely gonna vote because there's a lot of things that is going on, especially in New York City, that is just, you know, sometimes, you know, people campaign, you know, politicians, they're gonna do this, they're gonna do that. Then when they get in the office, nothing.
Right.
Nothing. So I guess we just have to keep voting them out till we get the right person.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot, I would say there are a lot more exciting candidates coming up. And so we got to show up for them. Some of them still suck. Some of them still not doing their job. But there are some people, especially candidates of color, candidates from our communities who are running, and they're not going to win if we don't show up for them. Right.
Definitely.
And it's okay that you only vote for the president. Like a lot of people only do that. But as you saw, like local and state elections are going to impact you more, right? Like, yeah, you're not going to really be able to vote on a ballot initiative on the federal level. That rarely happens. But here, you're literally like telling the city what to do. It's an opportunity, you know. So
definitely. I kind of understand that. And I'm like, oh, them politicians, like whatever. I don't even care. But now I'm like, you know what? I gotta care. You know, even though it's one vote, you know, can count for something and stuff. So definitely, I'm looking forward. So hopefully, we get a better, a better candidate this time that actually do what they do and stuff. Like you said earlier, the rent and everything is just crazy. A lot of people are just moving out of New York because the cost of living is so high. And I see the time to talk about the full house and all this affordable housing that you tell them is $2,000. You have to be under a bracket, income bracket. If you're not there, under, you don't qualify. You don't qualify, and you building them buildings like. Who can afford it in this community that you putting up these buildings that you so-called claim, you know,
are affordable?
No, they can't pay that because I'm even having, conversation with the director of this FIPS resident housing director that is in my community right now that is doing a lot of work, a great work for the community, helping everybody. I'm like, I just don't understand when they talk about affordable housing and you go in there trying to apply, but you don't really qualify. So why they putting them in a community that they know damn well nobody's gonna be able to qualify for those apartments that you're building and you're quote unquote affordable? I said we need to change that narrative because they're not affordable. Not in the community you're building and the cost of living and what the community is making, it's not affordable for them. So I think that is something that we, as minority people in community, need to push. Like, no, this is not affordable. We need to change that narrative.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Because the honest truth is when we chill and we don't activate and like move, the
Right.
landlords, the developers, they're screaming and shouting. And if they don't hear from us, no one's gonna do anything about it. So you're absolutely right. We gotta check them.
Yeah, that's why I always say, like, when we have our monthly tenants meeting, I'll be participant in that. I'm like, okay, we have opportunities. But if we don't say nothing, because I see other neighborhoods, the white neighborhoods, they are quick to write letters. They got buses, trains, they're running. But in other community, we don't say nothing because we don't go there knocking on the doors, writing letters, because they be writing letters like, hey, and you go there and the place is clean, but you call in the port community because we don't say nothing. So they just give us whatever. I said, no, we have to tell them what we want. They can't just come in and be like, here, you got to voice out what you want. And let's not just stick with this, the static code, like, hey, this is not what we want. Why don't you just come to our community and sit down with us and ask us what we want instead of just throwing something at us. And that's a conversation I'm always like having in a monthly meeting. Like we have to be, take charge and participate and tell them like, no. And we got to change that. We as a community, we as a minority, we got to come together and speak up. So a lot of changes can happen.
Absolutely. Definitely. I mean, I feel like that's a great point to close on, and it's also you're moving in the same history and legacy of Black and brown people who've done that since we were brought to the Western Hemisphere, right? We've never stopped.
Right.
We've never stopped advocating for ourselves. We've never stopped
Right.
organizing. We've never stopped figuring out short, mid, and long-term plans to liberation. And voting is just one small cog in a very,
Yeah.
very large and multi-layered plan of making sure that we have what we need to take care of ourselves and to live our most full, robust lives, right? So I'm really happy to hear that you're doing that organizing work in your building, that you're going to go out and vote on these ballot measures, which are part of that long-term plan to building liberation for ourselves, holding people
Yeah.
accountable.
Yes.
And I hope everyone else on the call, feels super, super prepared and ready to also participate in that one small piece of a really, really important long game.
Right. Because I know a lot of people be like, well, it's only one vote, it's not gonna make a difference. Yes, it does gonna make a difference. One vote can add to two. We just keep going till there is a difference. Because we have the power to change the narrative, to change our community. But we as a community, we have to come together and work together, even if it's not for us, but it's for our future, our children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. We should look up to that. And we have the power to say, no, we don't want this in our community. We don't need you bringing drugs in our community. We don't need you bringing, we can stop that. But we have to work together because I go to the Jewish community, they all work together. They're like this. So while we can't do that, while we can't come together for the greater good, so we need to start working within ourselves first before we can go out there and tell them like, this is what we want. We gotta all come together as one.
With you on our
So
side, Miss Leonora, I have no doubt. I have no doubt in our ability to win.
Yes, absolutely. I believe in that too. I believe in that, there will be changes, but changes have to start within us first.
Mhm.
Facts.
I'm
Powerful.
Gloria, even though she's
Y'all, thank you so much. John, I'm gonna pass it over to you. We're gonna close out for the evening.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time. I like to Leonora's point, like we matter, right? Every each and every one of us. If our votes didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying so hard to keep us from voting, you know? Um,
exactly.
and so like it's been a pleasure, and we can see the change that we were looking for. It's
Yes,
us, you know?
yes, start with us. Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you
Thank
y'all.
for
you.
the
Thank you,
Have a good night.
John, and for everything that you do at Poder and for all of us here in New York. We really appreciate the work that you're doing.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to be in contact with everyone. I'll send out the PowerPoint. I also dropped a link in the chat with information on 3 of the 4 ballots or measures that are on the ballot this November. And we'll just make sure to send out all of the info that we talked about today as well. Right.
yes.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
blessed
you.
one, everybody.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Bye.
You too, Patricia.